Now, to understand Stoicism, you have to understand the differences between virtue in the Stoic sense and indifference. And so I want to delve into virtue and indifference from the Stoic point of view. The first thing, and I mentioned this in other video blogs, that for the Stoics, virtue is the only good. And not only is it the only good, but virtue is the only prerequisite to happiness. On the other hand, if you take the Aristotelian point of view, virtue is the most important good. It is the most important good, but it's not the only good. There are other goods like health and prosperity and the well-being of family members, for example. For the Stoics, those things are not goods. Those things are indifferents. You might say, well, this is contradictory to the way we use good or goodness as we see it, or as it's contemporarily used in the modern world. And I would have to agree with that initial impression. But if you look more deeply at the Stoic sense of goodness, you'll understand their perspective and where they come from in deriving that perspective. So that's what I want to delve into today. What are the differences between, or what are the contrasting aspects of good, that is virtue, which is the only good for the Stoics, or in Stoicism, and indifference. So let's delve into that. Let's delve into the differences between virtue and indifference. The first thing I want to say before I delve into this is, again, for the Stoics, virtue is the only good, and not only is it the only good, but it's the only prerequisite to happiness. And then the Stoics link virtue, happiness, and nature together. They say that virtue, happiness, and nature all have similar qualities, such as coherence and orderliness. And then all else are indifference. All else other than virtue are indifference. And the question becomes, well, what are virtues? And then what are the indifferents? And so that's what we'll delve into today. The main thing that you want to keep in mind is, I mentioned, for example, that health for the Stoic is an indifferent, and wealth for the Stoic, or prosperity for the Stoic, is an indifferent. You have to keep in mind that their indifference do not mean trivialities. And so for the Stoics, these things are not trivialities, it's just that they are not good. And so what is goodness for the Stoics? The Stoics see goodness or good as things that have an influential impact and a consistent impact on the concepts of misery and happiness. And then they see indifference as things that have uninfluential impacts on the concepts, on one's misery and happiness. And so if we delve further and go to Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, and Chrysippus as well, we find that they subdivided indifference into two categories, being preferred indifference and dispreferred indifference. So for them, preferred indifference would be something like wealth. It's a preferred indifferent. And then poverty would be a dispreferred indifferent. And what you have to keep in mind is that there is another Stoic philosopher, his name is Aristo, and Aristo argued differently than Chrysippus and Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. And so Aristo said, or suggested, that all indifferents are ethically non-significant. All indifferents are ethically non-significant. And then other Stoic philosophers like Epictetus followed in the footsteps of Aristo and took that point of view, which is a more extreme point of view than that of Zeno and Chrysippus, whereby they subdivided indifference into preferred indifference and dispreferred indifference. Now, the Stoics claim the virtue is good, whereas indifference are neither good nor bad. There's one defining feature of virtue, and one way to contrast virtue. That's one approach by which we can separate virtue from indifference. So the Stoics claim that virtue is good, whereas indifferents are neither good nor bad. There are four cardinal virtues for the Stoics. These include wisdom, they include courage, they include temperance, and they include justice. What you have to keep in mind here is that we ought to look at the way the Stoics view goodness, as I said earlier. Now, the Stoics view goodness as things that consistently benefit us. And these are matters which consistently benefit us and in their inherent nature benefit us. Whereas indifference for the Stoics are things that can be used for good or for bad. And so an indifferent for the Stoic would be something like wealth. Wealth can be used for good or for bad. And same thing for poverty, the opposite of wealth. It can be used for good or it can be used for bad. The same thing for health. Health can be used for good or it can be used for bad. And so for the Stoics, these are indifferents. For the Aristotelians, or the Aristotle point of view, these are goods. They're not as good as virtue, the most important good in the Aristotelian sense, but they're still goods. They're still good. So for the Stoics, matters which do not benefit consistently are not good. And so a list of indifference would be things like pleasure and the opposite of pleasure, health and the opposite of health, disease, strength and the opposite of strength, weakness, pain and the opposite of pain, prettiness or beauty and the opposite of beauty, a noble birth and the opposite of that, low reputation. These are indifferents for the Stoics because they do not benefit us consistently. They can be used for good or they can be used for bad, and thus they are not by their inherent nature good things. And so Epictetus, if you look at his writings, uses a term as a substitute for indifference, and that is that of externals. Epictetus would define those externals, or the indifference, it's a substitute for indifference, as things that rest outside the domain of our control, or at least partly outside the domain of our control. Once we get into the dichotomy of control in a separate module, we'll see that Epictetus separate matters into things that rest within our control, our complete control, and things that sit outside of our control. But in reality, there's oftentimes a phenomenon whereby we have a trichotomy of control. So the potentiality of that is very apparent and intuitive in the sense that there are things that rest partly in our control, but not in our full control. And so Epictetus uses externals as a substitute for the term indifference. And he says that those externals are things that rest beyond our control. And so from the point of view of Epictetus, a very significant and perhaps my favorite Stoic philosopher, the things that rest outside the domain of our control are indifference. So for Epictetus, for example, reputation rests outside of one's own control, and thus it's an indifferent. So I hope I delineated some of the differences between virtue and indifference. So virtue, for instance, consistently benefits us. It not only benefits you, but it benefits the other. And it benefits by its own very nature. On the other hand, indifference do not consistently benefit us. They can be used for good or they can be used for bad. And not only that, but indifference do not by their very nature benefit us. So for example, wealth does not by its very nature benefit. It can be used for good or bad, and thus it's an indifferent.